Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today, a philosopher is going to be watching Lord of the Rings. So this is the scene of Gandalf and Frodo in the mines of Moria.
She knows thinking. Miri, hot and hungry. There's something down there.
It's Gollum.
Gollum.
He's been following us for 3 days.
He escaped the dungeons of Barad-dûr.
Escaped. Or was set loose. And now the ring has drawn him here. He will never get rid of his need for it. He hates and loves the ring. As he hates and loves himself. Smeagol's life is a sad story. Yes, Smeagol, he was once called. Before the ring found him. Before it drove him mad.
It's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance.
Pity. It was pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. Many that live deserve death. And some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them, Frodo? Do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment. Even the very wise cannot see all ends. My heart tells me that Gollum has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before this is over. The pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of men.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.
Okay, do you have any first thoughts after seeing it?
If I've understood it right, they've arrived in these mines but are lost. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the first thing to say, because this scene comes roughly halfway through the movie,
Yeah.
and the idea of being lost in the middle is quite a important trope. And I don't think explicitly, but perhaps implicitly, it picks up on the notion in Dante of being midway through life's journey. And of course, the Lord of the Rings is a journey. It's an epic journey. It's a romantic journey in the spirit of romance, but not in the spirit of romantic love. And what Dante essentially implies is that when we're in the lost place in the middle of the journey, when things are at their most desperate or darkest, is precisely the moment when the greatest insights arrive. So wisdom, can't really be accessed in moments of sort of joy. It's actually something which arises, in a different place, basically. So I think that's the first thing to say. And there's that notion of being lost in the middle, but finding insight in some way, is actually a trope that's picked up in the modern day in completely different contexts. I mean, there's a thing called Theory U by a man called Otto Scharmer, who says if we're going from A to B, we always go too fast. And it's better really to dip down before you go up to B and enter the kind of the bottom of the U-bend, because in the U-bend, when we're lost, we're more likely to have insight.
Free will versus fate.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think was the answer in that scene?
Well, there is an exchange between these two archetypes, and they are quite archetypical. The Ian McKellen character is the sage, the older man, and the younger man, Frodo, is the sort of inheritor, younger Ephebe learner who's going to sort of carry on the mantle. And there's a certain sense of the transmission of energy from one to the other. So, before we get into whether or not, Frodo has the free will to decide to take on the quest for the ring or not, there's a higher order level of determinism, I think, which is going on, which is to say, there is an archetypal structure here between the older sage and the younger learner. And that gives us roles to play out in life, as it were. So there's kind of shaping that goes on at the archetype level. We play the roles we've been given. So even before we talk about free will in terms of conscious intention or what have you, just simply by virtue of being cast in those two roles, there are ways of behaving, ways of acting out destiny, I suppose, which those archetypes determine in some ways. Because an archetype isn't just a description of a typology and a set of characteristics, but in a certain sense is also a predictor of fate, of what people will actually do in life.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the scene, they're lost, but there's a kind of underlying agreement that Gandalf doesn't really think they're lost. Like, he's not really lost. So, as in, like, he knows the way, he's just trying to remember. And it's almost like after that scene happens, then he remembers where to go. So he was waiting for Frodo to have that moment where he kind of says the wrong thing in, it's a pity he didn't kill him when he had the chance, so that he could learn that lesson and to go through that kind of development.
Yeah, and you also have to remember, we the viewer are watching this as an artificial construct. It's a movie. We know we're halfway through the film. We know they're going to be lost only temporarily, but that the heroes will in some way turn it around and find whatever they're looking for. So there is, again, at a kind of meta level, a sense of an emerging, freedom that will come out of this. And that this is in some ways just a trope of the movie. There's a phase of lostness before the phase of foundness, again, which is really nothing to do with them as characters per se. What I'm saying is, even over and above the archetypes that they might represent, we're simply watching a movie which has a certain length and needs a certain story arc. And the story arc of this one is a bit like that Theory U. It goes along, goes down, it goes up again. And actually when it goes up, and this is Otto Scharmer's point, in Theory U, you don't just go down and come up to reach point B, but you go down and come up and actually reach a point C that you never would have anticipated had you simply raced from A to B. Because the stepping into uncertainty allows for actually a greater onward movement, and means you find a destination which you hadn't actually envisioned in the first place.
Almost maybe as an audience then we're going through that change as well, like that stop. Like, obviously it's because it's a movie, but that kind of feeling of lostness with Frodo, you kind of learn that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if we are identifying with him at some level, that's gonna happen, and that's the aim, of lots of, well, not just movie narratives but narratives in general, to involve you in the story as a quasi participant, so that you feel similar emotions to those in the story, sense of loss or desperation or uncertainty, which you hope will be redeemed and transformed as the plot line develops.
Do you have anything to say about the ethics of the scene? What is said? The kind of Frodo suddenly realizing that what he said was quite harsh about not killing this character when Bilbo had a chance, and the element of mercy. When do we have mercy on someone? When don't we have mercy? And the powers at play, what that can then lead to.
I mean, the word I heard was more pity than mercy
pity.
In that particular clip. And what I think Gandalf is trying to encourage the young man who's in this learner mode to realise is that we ought to have some sort of predisposition towards pity and perhaps mercy, because the larger movement of the world is ultimately a benign one. And in a way, the Ian McKellen character is kind of correcting the slightly more vengeful view that Frodo has there. I mean, if you wanted to, this is a bit of a stretch, but if you wanted to read this kind of theologically, you would say that Frodo in that moment represents a kind of Old Testament view of the world. Let's take vengeance, through a kind of natural justice. This has happened, so this person must be punished in a kind of equalizing. Whereas the Ian McKellen character, Gandalf, represents more of a New Testament Christianized view, which says actually we need to move beyond tit for tat and see the bigger picture here, and that things like pity are higher virtues than justice.
Yeah, that's interesting because Gandalf is a kind of Jesus character in that he dies and then comes back. He's resurrected as a kind of different Gandalf the White.
Yeah. So there's a bit of, I wouldn't overstress it, but there's a bit of a kind of latent Christian theme there, or contrast between Old and New Testament ways of thinking. One embodied in the notion of justice as Frodo, and one is that of pity, which is a sort of Christian, slightly more sentimental, potentially more metaphysical view of the world.
And what's the difference between pity and mercy?
Well, mercy has a different set of connotations. I was thinking, this may sound bizarre, but the word mercy is related to the French word merci, thanks.
Yeah, I thought that.
And
I always think that when I say mercy in French.
Yeah, and by association, it's associated with those things which are given, like thanks, over and above what's necessary, like grace, the word grace, and thanks, in Spanish, gracias. So grace is, in a sense, connected with mercy, and mercy is this slightly more spiritual notion, I suppose, of forbearance and giving something over and above what might actually be necessary in the moment. So in the Frodo view of the world, there's a zero-sum tit-for-tat game. Mercy is rising above that and saying there's something extra here, or I am the bigger person, and so I'm capable of mercy. Pity, is not dissimilar, but pity, I think, has more of a quality of sentiment to it, and you probably index it ever so slightly closer to contempt, because if you say you pity somebody, it can be said positively, but it's often used quite negatively to pity somebody, as if belittling them or looking down on them. So it's as if there's a bit of an overlap between pity and mercy in the middle, but actually they diverge as well, I think, particularly insofar as pity becomes something that can be a little bit mocking of the other person. Mercy, again, slightly more associated with religious virtues and values, really. And of course, famously, God is somebody who's capable of showing mercy to people and not exacting revenge or demanding a kind of punishment of them.
Yeah, because if I knew that someone pitied me, it wouldn't feel good.
No, but on the other hand, if you're condemned to death and the emperor takes pity on you and spares you from that death, we're then again in that overlap between pity and mercy.
Does it depend on who it's coming from?
Well, I think in the case of mercy, the implication is that the person giving mercy has the greater width or expanse of soul and character in order to be able to dispense that mercy. With pity, again, it's slightly more ambivalent because it can tend towards that, but it can also tend towards a kind of pusillanimous soul on the part of the person who's displaying pity. Because if you belittle someone, it comes out of a small place in the first place. So the person who pities is often themselves a little bit pitiable because their soul is a little bit smaller, as it were.
Interesting. So in the line that Gandalf says, all we have to do is decide what to do with the time that is given to us. I think like a lot of people watched that scene during lockdown and it was shared quite widely on social media. And I think people really resonated with that line because at the time we all found ourselves in like, we couldn't really make any decisions for ourselves, and so that really kind of helped people kind of make sense of it all. But yeah, what's the kind of like philosophy behind that?
Well, there's a lot going on in that line. One is this notion of free will that you picked up on before. Like, although the length of life is given to us, we're mortal. We're not going to live forever, and therefore there is an absolute limit on our lives. On the other hand, our lives are absolutely unlimited insofar as we can choose what to do with them. Now, you can debate how true that is or not, and if you're, anybody of a broadly, let's call it Marxist persuasion, you will believe actually your life is far more conditioned by your class than it is by anything else, and the choices you're able to make are similarly constrained. So the idea of freedom of choice, from this more Marxist perspective at least, would be considered a pretty bourgeois thing to say. It's like, well, you might have a freedom of choice if you're of a class and of the means to have those choices, but if you don't, tough luck. But the other thing so that's one angle on that. Another angle would be to say, well, that suggests, that line, that we know how much time we have allocated to us, and then we'll kind of distribute our activity and efforts accordingly across that timeline. But of course, that's not true. I mean, one of the definitions of being mortal is none of us actually knows when we'll die. We know on average we might have a life expectancy. We know, therefore, that it's likely that we'll live a certain number of years, but death per se can happen at any time. That's one of its defining qualities. So it can lull us into a false sense of security to think, okay, I've got my 70 years and 10, and therefore I'm going to spend my 20s working, my 30s having a child, my 40s bringing up the children, and so on, retiring. Because that assumes that we've been given an allocated amount of time, which is sort of average for our social and biological circumstance. But there's nothing about death which complies with that whatsoever. And we know this on a daily basis. We read about accidents and murders and so on. And in fact, we shouldn't really call accidents in that respect, because it's a perfectly proper characteristic of death that it can happen at any time. This is, among several sort of thinkers who pointed this out, I suppose Heidegger would be the one who would come to mind. He talks about the kind of intrinsic randomness of death. It has nothing about it which obeys any kind of fixed calendar whatsoever.
Yeah, for me, from that quote, I kind of got from it that I didn't feel like he was saying we've got loads of time. I felt like he was saying, okay, you've got this, what you've got right now. I felt like it was more living in the moment and deciding what you can do right now, and that's what can give you comfort, is that you can decide anything now.
Yeah, I think I would agree. The point was more about choice and making good choices, and owning those choices and recognizing that you do have agency up to a point, despite the fact there are larger forces at work. And that's sort of one of the messages that Gandalf's trying to impart there, I think, to Bilbo, is that, we've got both things going on at the same time. We do live in a universe in which there are higher laws which are largely inscrutable and which we can't overturn. And yet, paradoxically, we have some freedom to act in accordance with our own will. Now, logically, how is it possible to have those two things at the same time? How can we live a determined life and be self-determining? I mean, it's one of the central paradoxes of, you know, certainly the Western and probably the Eastern philosophical tradition. And yet, you know, maybe it's a paradox that just is true. And so the onus is on us to then work out how it's true and live accordingly. Thanks very much for watching this video. It's very much appreciated. If you do like it, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you.